Have you ever asked yourself why certain things happen, especially the difficult ones? Why pain seems to come, even when you've tried your best? Why do good people suffer, and those with cold hearts seem untouched? These questions are not simply philosophical, they're personal. They arise late at night, in quiet tears, in moments when everything else falls away. And for many, they remain unanswered. But perhaps the answer isn't something to be handed to us. Maybe it's something to be revealed, slowly, gently, when we're truly ready to listen, not with the mind that analyzes, but with the heart that feels. And perhaps it doesn't come in the form of words or doctrines, but through silence, through nature, through stories that speak not to our logic, but to our soul. This video is a journey into such a space, a retreat from noise, from urgency, from the constant need to know and control. It's a journey to a mountain monastery, not just as a place, but as a state of being. A space where breath becomes sacred, where walking is a meditation, where every falling leaf is a teaching in impermanence. It begins with a traveler, not a guru, not a master, just someone like you, like me, someone carrying quiet questions and invisible burdens. They come to the monastery not looking for enlightenment, but simply seeking peace. And what they find is not a doctrine to memorize, but a way of seeing a way of being through their experience. We're invited to slow down, to let go of the search for immediate answers, and instead, to be present with the questions. The bell that rings in the mist, the pine that sways without resistance, the stream that flows around obstacles, all become teachers. Each moment is a doorway, each silence, a deep well. In this journey, you'll hear stories, some ancient, some everyday. You'll witness the unfolding of quiet realizations, subtle shifts, and the kind of wisdom that doesn't shout, but stays with you. You might not come out of this with a clear answer to why do things happen the way they do, but you may come out with a deeper understanding of how to meet what happens with clarity, compassion, and stillness. So take a breath, let your shoulders drop, give yourself this time. There's no urgency here, no need to grasp or strive. Just listen. Let the rhythm of the words, the stillness of the mountains, and the silence between the stories speak to you. Because sometimes, what you truly seek is not a reason, but a return to yourself, to peace, to the present. You arrive before dawn, when the mountains are still wrapped in a soft mist like a white silk scarf stretched across the sky. The winding path to the monastery flows gently, like a slow-moving stream through a silent pine forest. The scent of pine needles, the earthy aroma after last night's rain, and the distant call of forest birds seem to awaken something deep within you. This is not a vacation, nor an escape. It is a return. You bring no specific question with you, yet your heart is heavy with things unnamed. A vague sense of nostalgia arises, as if you are missing something very old, very far. Could it be that you miss yourself? Or perhaps you miss a sense of peace that you once had, but lost amid the bustle of daily life. You are unsure. You only know that here, as your feet touch the mossy stone path. You feel lighter, as though shedding an invisible burden you've carried too long. The monastery gradually emerges from the mist, not imposing, not dazzling. The old, curved roof tiles resemble a young crescent moon, the wooden walls tinted with the hues of time. The stone garden spread with fine white sand and gentle rake marks all appear like whispers of the past. Time seems suspended here. Each falling leaf becomes sacred. Each sound echoes with mystery. You're led to a small room at the end of a wooden corridor. The door opens onto a tiny garden where an ancient pine stands quietly, its roots deep into stone, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze. There is no furniture, only a straw mat, a meditation cushion, and a small bell hanging by the doorframe. That is enough. You sit down, exhaling a long breath. Something within you begins to melt from afar. The great monastery bell rings, its resonance like an invisible wave reaching into the depths of your heart. No one says a word, yet you know the journey has truly begun. Not a journey outward, but inward. Not to seek an answer out there, but to listen to the questions within. From that moment on, nature is no longer a backdrop. It becomes your companion. The mist is a shawl that shields the fragility of your soul. The wind is the breath of the earth, reminding you to slow down. The ancient pine is a testament that all things steadfast arise from patience. And here, in this stillness that teems with life, you realize the first truth to begin a journey inward. You don't need many reasons. You just need to stop, truly stop, and be willing to listen. The morning light begins to stretch its fingers over the peaks, turning the mist into a shimmering veil of gold. A squirrel darts across the path ahead of you. A single petal floats gently from a nearby tree, landing silently on a rock. Each detail feels magnified, infused with quiet importance. This heightened sensitivity is not imagined. It is what happens when the noise inside begins to quiet, when presence takes the place of anticipation. You step out into the courtyard, barefoot now, as instructed. The stone beneath your feet is cold, grounding. Across the garden, a monk sweeps the path with slow, deliberate movements, not out of urgency, but with full presence. Even this act of sweeping seems like a ritual and offering. The brush of straw against stone, the rustle of sand, the echo of the wind all harmonize into a symphony of mindfulness. A stream runs behind the monastery, barely audible unless you listen carefully. As you approach it, you see how the water dances over small stones, curving around roots and flowing with gentle persistence. You sit beside it for a while. The sound is soothing, constant, effortless, and you wonder what would it be like to flow as water does, to stop resisting, to let go of the shape you think you must hold, and simply respond to the terrain of each moment in this stillness. Memory stirs. You recall moments in your life that felt like struggle times when you pushed against reality, when plans unraveled and emotions surged. But sitting here, by this stream, it occurs to you that perhaps struggle is not the only way. Maybe there's wisdom in water's way to yield, but never to be broken. You look up and see the monastery perched on the hillside, its structure modest but enduring. It is shaped not in defiance of the mountain, but in harmony with it, built to fit within the folds of the land, not to impose upon it. There's a message in that, a subtle invitation to live aligned rather than against, to shape your life not by forcing paths open, but by sensing the natural flow of things. The bell rings again, Its echo rolls through the valley like ripples on water. You rise and return to the path. Something inside you slightly changed, not transformed yet, but softened, opened. The day is just beginning, and already, without a word of doctrine, the land and its silence have begun to teach. He appeared without fanfare, walking slowly along the garden path as the bell's echo faded into the distance. Clad in a simple ochre robe, his steps barely disturbed the gravel beneath his feet. There was no declaration of his role, no air of authority, only a gentle, grounded presence. As he passed, your eyes met. His gaze, calm and timeless, seemed to hold both the weight of ages and the lightness of a leaf in autumn. He did not speak at first. Instead, he gestured for you to follow, and so you did, without question. As if some part of you had long awaited this moment, he led you through a narrow trail behind the main hall, where the trees grew denser, the air cooler. The forest opened to a small clearing, where a stone bench sat beside a tree whose branches curled like prayerful hands. "You are not lost," he finally said, his voice quiet yet resonant. "You are simply beginning again." The words surprised you. You hadn't spoken your confusion, your doubts, yet somehow they were answered. He sat on the stone bench, inviting you to do the same. A long silence followed, one that didn't press for answers, but softened the space between you. "Everything that has brought you here," he continued, "is not a mistake. It is part of the unfolding." You asked, tentatively, about pain, why life can feel so heavy, despite good intentions. He listened, nodding gently, his eyes never leaving the shifting pattern of light on the ground. "Pain is not punishment," he said. "It is invitation. It is how the heart cracks open enough to grow." He spoke then of impermanence, not as a concept to grasp, but as a rhythm to observe. The way the wind shifts a branch, the way sunlight flickers and fades. Everything changes, he said, and that includes sorrow. If we stop clinging to our suffering, it too will pass. A leaf drifted down between you, spinning slowly in descent. He picked it up, turning it in his hand. "See this. It is no longer part of the tree, but it is not dead. It continues feeding the soil, softening the path." You felt something loosen inside. Not relief, not yet, but a softening of resistance. He told a story, then of a boy who lost everything in a fire. The villagers pitied him, offered comfort, but the old monk of the village simply said, "Let's see." Days later, a stranger came to rebuild the house. Then a traveler offered the boy apprenticeship. At each turn, the monk responded the same, "Let's see." Over time, the boy's life transformed not because things got better, but because he learned not to judge what was happening as good or bad. "So much suffering," the monk said, "comes from deciding too quickly what something means. We can live more peacefully by staying open to mystery." He rose slowly, motioning toward the path again. "Walk with me." As you walked, he offered no more teachings, just the rhythm of footsteps, the rustle of leaves, and now and then, the soft sound of his breath. In this presence, you didn't need instruction. You simply followed, absorbed, remembered. That evening, you wrote only one line in your journal. "Today I learned that impermanence is not a loss, but a path to peace." That night, sleep did not come easily, though the body was still. the mind continued to drift, as if the silence of the monastery amplified the voices you had long kept at bay. Images surfaced, unresolved moments, lost opportunities, words unspoken. Not loud or dramatic, but persistent, like gentle tapping on the door of consciousness. In the dark, you sat up and listened to the wind, to the rustle of leaves, to your own breath. And there, in that deep quiet, you finally admitted something to yourself you didn't feel whole, not broken, but not complete. Something was unsettled not because of the outer world, but because of an inner gap, a dissonance. The next morning, the monk noticed your weariness. Tiredness of the body is honest, he said, but tiredness of the spirit is an invitation. He led you again into the forest, this time to a small hut perched near a ridge. From there, the valley stretched wide and open, and mist floated in long ribbons through the trees. "Tell me," he asked, "what weighs on you?" You spoke hesitantly of your confusion, not about events themselves, but about your reactions to them. You felt pulled between extremes, wanting to let go, yet clinging, longing for peace, yet drawn to distraction, seeking truth, yet fearing what it might demand. He listened. Then he said, "The mind resists contradiction, but life is contradiction. It is not logic that binds this world, but tension. And that tension is not your enemy, it is your teacher." He told the story of a young woman who asked a master, "How do I choose between two paths?" The master gave her a violin and asked her to play a single note. "Now hold it steady," he said. As she did, he gently touched the string. The vibration changed. The sound wavered, deepened, became richer. "Do you hear that?" he said. "Beauty is born not from stillness alone, but from its disturbance. So too," the monk said, "with your heart. Its wisdom comes not from choosing one side over another, but from standing still enough to feel both. The unease, then, was not failure. It was growth, the churning of transformation. You realized that your suffering didn't stem from life being wrong, but from your expectation that it should be simple. Later, walking alone by the stream, you noticed how water carves stone, not in defiance, but in rhythm. The stream does not avoid the rocks. It dances with them. So too, could you move through contradiction, not by resolution, but by grace? That evening, the monk shared tea with you beneath a sky full of stars. "Do not rush to name your pain," he said. "Let it speak. Let it unfold. Sometimes what feels like confusion is simply the opening of a deeper knowing." And as the stars pulsed gently above, you felt a new kind of rest, one that did not come from answers, but from allowing yourself to be held by the question. The following day brought a heavier sky. Clouds drifted low, and the air felt thick, as if the world itself had paused in contemplation. The monk invited you to join him by the temple garden, where fallen petals scattered like fragments of forgotten time. "There is something I have not yet spoken of," he said as he kneeled near a small stone statue. "It is karma, not the punishment people imagine, but the connection they forget." He cupped water from a nearby basin and let it spill slowly through his fingers. Every thought, every act, every word, these are seeds. Most people sow without knowing. Then, when the harvest comes, they call it fate. You asked if that meant suffering is deserved. "No," he said firmly. "Karma is not blame, it is pattern. What you feel today may be shaped by what you didn't even see yesterday. And what you touch today may ripple across time in ways you'll never know. He told you a story from long ago of a young man who once stole a loaf of bread during a famine, not out of greed, but hunger. Years later, as a merchant, he could never understand why his store was always vandalized. It wasn't until he returned to his childhood village and wept before the ruins of the old bakery that he began to feel the thread. The universe does not forget, the monk said, not out of punishment, but out of rhythm. It remembers what we forget, and sometimes it brings us back to places we left undone. You sat in silence, watching an ant trail weave over a stone. How much in life had you written off as coincidence? How often had you cursed outcomes, not seeing the roots that afternoon? He asked you to rake the sand garden, move with intention. He said, each circle you draw will remain, even after the wind. As you worked, your thoughts wandered to past choices, the careless words, the impatience, the kindnesses too late. The lines you made in the sand felt like a quiet prayer I see now. I remember, I choose again. That evening, the monk spoke of liberation. Karma is not a prison. He said, it is a path. Each step taken in awareness changes the next. The old momentum may still carry weight, but the moment you awaken, the current begins to shift. He held up a single leaf. This fell not because of one gust of wind, but because of all the winds that came before. And so it is with us. That night, as you fell asleep, you did not ask for answers. You asked for clarity to walk forward with open eyes and an open heart, knowing that even pain, when seen with wisdom, can become a turning point toward freedom. The next morning, the sun returned, casting long golden rays through the thin curtains of your room. The sound of a distant bell stirred you gently from sleep. As you stepped outside, the air smelled of dew and blooming jasmine. Something felt different, not in the world, but in your way of seeing it. The monk greeted you with a nod, and together you walked to a small rise overlooking the valley. There, he paused and said, "You've seen karma. Now let's talk about freedom." You blinked. Weren't those two opposite ideas, karma, with its momentum and past roots, freedom, with its open field of possibility? He smiled, as if reading your thoughts, Mo. Most people think freedom means having no consequences, but true freedom comes from choosing with awareness, knowing there are consequences and choosing anyway. He explained that life is not about escaping responsibility, but embracing it, not with guilt, but with clarity. Freedom, he said, is the ability to respond, not react. It's the space between impulse and action. He picked up a small stone and tossed it into the river below. That stone cannot choose where it lands. But you can pause, you can breathe, you can consider. That day, you were asked to prepare the midday meal. It seemed simple enough, but each action, cutting vegetables, boiling water, stirring rice, became a meditation. You noticed how your hands moved, how your mind wandered, how often your body rushed even when time was ample. The monk joined you in silence, and when the meal was done, he said, in every act, we are planting something. Freedom is not about doing whatever you want. It's about doing what's in harmony with what you know. Later, under the shade of a large fig tree, he told a parable. There was a man, he said, who kept stumbling in the same place every day. He blamed the stone, the path, even the sun. But one day, he looked inward and asked, "What is it in me that does not see that question?" The monk said, "Is the seed of transformation." In the following days, he encouraged you to observe your choices, not to judge them, but to understand them. Why did you speak certain words? Why did you avoid certain feelings? Why did you chase some pleasures and not others? You began to see how many of your decisions were not truly free, but habits, fears, or inherited beliefs. This realization did not depress you. It awakened you. Awareness is the gate. The monk said, "Freedom is not the absence of structure. It is the wisdom to walk with structure, not be ruled by it." And so you walked. You chose your words more gently, your pauses more deliberately. You noticed when you were about to retreat and stayed. You noticed when you were about to judge and listened instead. By the end of that week, you wrote in your journal, "I used to think freedom meant escape. Now, I see it means presence. Choosing not just what feels good, but what feels true." The river ran with quiet determination, a slow and winding current shaped by the contours of time. At a bend, near the edge of the temple grounds, there was a large stone that sat partly submerged, unmoved despite the flow. One morning, the monk brought you there. "Watch," he said simply, and sat beside it. At first, it was just water and rock, but as you sat in silence, you began to notice the river did not try to avoid the stone. It met it directly. It did not retreat. It did not complain. It curved. It eddied. It rippled, and in doing so, it carved. "This," the monk said, "is the lesson we often miss. Most try to move away from what is hard, but the river, its wisdom, is to meet the hard thing and keep flowing." He invited you to place your hand on the stone. It was cool, smooth in places, but sharp in others. "This stone," he said, "has shaped the river, but the river has also shaped it. Life is not one or the other, it is both. We are influenced, and we influence. We are hurt, and we heal." The monk began to tell a story. There was once a woman named Leon who lived beside a river much like this one. She had known loss a child, a partner, a future she had dreamt. In her grief, she came to sit by the stone every day, asking why. Why me? Why now? Why this year's past? Her questions changed. They became, how do I live with this? How do I carry it? And one day, they changed again. How has this shaped me? Over time, Leon became a teacher, not because her pain was resolved, but because she had walked with it long enough to see its form. "This stone in my heart," she said, "has become my strength. It did not soften me, it deepened me." As the monk finished the story, he looked at you and asked, "What are the stones in your river?" The question lingered. You didn't answer aloud, but inside, you began to list them: moments of betrayal, words you never said, dreams that didn't unfold. You sat with them, not to fix, but to recognize. The sun rose higher, casting shadows behind the rock. You noticed how even the shadow curved with the river's bend. Nothing in nature was rigid. Even the obstacles bowed with time. In the following days, you returned to that stone. Some mornings in silence, others with a journal. You noticed your resistance softening. You no longer asked why the stone was there. You asked what it was teaching. You wrote, "This pain is not a punishment. It is a path. It will not move because I fight it, but it will shape me if I let it." By the end of the week, the monk met you again. "You have changed," he said, "not because the stone is gone, but because you now see the river." The garden was never just a place. It was a teacher, a mirror, a field where silence took root. The first morning you stepped into it, you felt nothing special, only dew on leaves, distant bird calls, a rake resting on smooth gravel. But as the days unfolded, the garden unfolded you. The monk walked with you along the path one day, his hands behind his back. "This garden," he said softly, "is where karma becomes visible. Every stone laid, every branch pruned, every weed pulled. It is not just action. It is intention made manifest. You were given a corner of the garden to care for, a patch of soil, some young tea plants. At first, it seemed simple. Water, tend, observe. But the monk watched, then whispered, "Tend it as you would tend your mind, and watch what grows." That changed everything. Each morning, you approached the soil differently, not as a task, but as a mirror. Were you rushing? Then your strokes were uneven. Were you distracted? Then you forgot to water. Were you angry? Then your hands became rough with the stems. One afternoon, as you knelt to remove weeds, the monk told you of karmic seeds. In the Abhidhamma, he said, they speak of bija seeds in the mind stream. Every thought, word, and deed plants a seed. Some grow quickly. Some sleep for lifetimes. But all respond to conditions. You asked, "What if I planted something harmful without knowing?" He replied, "Then know it now, and begin to water what is good. We are not bound by what we have planted. We are shaped by what we choose to nourish." There was a moment of silence. The garden held it gently. In the days that followed, the garden became your meditation hall. You bowed before entering. You listened to what the soil needed. You saw the parallel between pruning a branch and letting go of a thought, between pulling a weed and releasing a regret. One day, while clearing stones from a path, you uncovered a small sprout beneath. It had been growing in the dark, unseen. And yet, it reached toward the light. You felt something stir. "This is your mind," the monk said from behind you. "The roots you cannot see, but they are there, waiting for space, for light, for you." By the end of your first moon cycle, the tea plants had changed. But more than that, your gaze had changed. You no longer saw the garden as separate from you. It was you. It showed you what you nurtured, what you neglected, what you feared, and what you loved. The monk smiled one evening, watching you rake with care. "Most come here looking for peace," he said. "But real peace is when you see clearly the seeds you are sowing, and you choose moment by moment to plant what heals." And so you did, and so you do. It began with a question. If everything happens for a reason, why do some suffer without cause? The monk, stirring tea in his cup, smiled faintly, because what we see is only one thread. Karma is not a line, it is a weave. He drew 2 lines in the sand, one straight, one curved. Most people live as if life is like this straight line action, then result. But reality is curved, tangled. There are many threads, and some belong not only to you, but to all beings. You blinked. How can karma not belong only to me? Karma is personal, but it's also shared. Your anger does not stay in you. It touches others. The responses ripple back. The pattern is complex. To untangle it, we must look not only within, but all around. You spent the next days in study and silence. The library at the monastery was small, but deep. One book spoke of collective karma, another of delayed fruition, another still of karma interrupted and transformed. One passage read, "Karma is not justice, but consequence, not punishment, but unfolding." The monk helped you map your own life not in years, but in patterns. You saw how your fear of rejection came from a moment in childhood, but was fed by silence, by hiding, by overgiving. You saw how one act of dishonesty grew roots, not because of its weight, but because of your denial of it. He explained the four conditions: seed, field, water, and climate. Even the best seed cannot grow in poison. Even the worst seed may flower if tended with awareness. One afternoon, a small boy arrived with his mother. The boy was blind. He laughed easily, touched everything with joy. His mother wept in private. "Why him?" she asked. The monk said gently, "Not because he deserved it, but because something greater is being shown through him. His joy may awaken something in others, and perhaps in another life. He was the one who gave sight to many. You saw it then. Karma was not a ledger. It was a river, sometimes calm, sometimes torrential, sometimes diverted by a single act of kindness. And always, it could be transformed." The monk's last words on the matter stayed with you. Karma is not fate. It is habit, and habits can be changed, but not by force, only by love. There was a bell that rang every morning at sunrise, not to command, but to remind. It did not say hurry. It simply asked, "Are you here?" And each morning, as you rose, you began to understand that presence is not something you find. It is something you stop covering. The practice of slow mindfulness was introduced not as a lecture, but as an invitation. Move at the pace of your breath. The monk said, "Let your feet teach your mind how to arrive." The first time you practiced walking meditation, you were restless. Your legs wanted to stride. Your thoughts outran your steps. But the monk's voice was gentle. Notice the texture of the earth. Hear how your feet kiss the ground. You tried again. Slower. Slower still. In time, something softened. You felt the sun through leaves, the grain of wood under your fingertips, the temperature of the bowl in your palms. Nothing changed, but everything was different. Each task at the monastery became a field of mindfulness. Sweeping was not about clean floors, but clear attention. Eating was not about fullness, but communion with life. Silence was not about the absence of sound, but the richness of stillness. You remember the day you peeled a single orange slowly, as if each pull of the skin was prayer. You ate each segment, not for taste, but for understanding. Where did this fruit come from? Who picked it? What sunlight entered it? It became a hymn of gratitude. The monk told you of the Zen saying, "When walking, just walk. When eating, just eat." At first, it seemed too simple. Then it became profound. You met an old nun who never spoke, but smiled with her whole being. You watched her pour tea, sweep leaves, light incense, all with a grace that seemed beyond time. When asked why, she moved so slowly. Another monk said, "Because she is never in a hurry to miss life." One evening, you sat on a bench, watching the wind in the bamboo. Nothing to do, nowhere to be, and yet, the fullness inside you brought tears. Slow mindfulness, you realized, was not about speed, it was about depth. It was the difference between touching and being touched. You began to walk differently, talk differently, even in thought. You slowed down, not to analyze, but to witness. And in this witnessing, a new life bloomed, not made of events, but of presence. One day, you asked the monk, "Is this all mindfulness?" He laughed. Mindfulness is not a thing. It is a way of returning, again and again and again. And so you returned to yourself, to breath, to tea, to silence. You returned not because life demanded it, but because your heart remembered how beautiful it felt to truly arrive. It was a simple meal: rice, steamed greens, miso soup, nothing extravagant, no indulgence. Yet, that day, it became sacred. The monk rang a soft bell, and everyone bowed before lifting a spoon. Each person sat in silence, hands gently resting on laps. The room did not speak, but it breathed together. You watched the steam rise from your bowl, and you waited. The monk said, "Before you eat, thank the 10,000 hands that brought this meal to you. The earth, the rain, the farmer, the cook." It struck you then how disconnected you had become from food. It had been fuel, distraction, comfort. But now, each grain of rice held a story. Each leaf had traveled far. This wasn't just nourishment, it was a miracle of interbeing. As you chewed slowly, you noticed your breath. You noticed the sound of others chewing in rhythm. You noticed how the spoon felt in your hand. The meal asked nothing of you but presence, and in return, it offered connection. You recalled a teaching when eating. Eat, not your worries, not your plans, just the food. One elderly monk told you how, in wartime, he had eaten roots and bark. "Now," he said, "I taste the sunlight in cabbage." Gratitude grows when suffering teaches you what hunger truly means. You practiced this meal, meditation daily, sometimes with joy, sometimes with tears, but always with reverence. One day, a child visitor spilled his bowl. The room froze, but the monk chuckled and helped him clean up. "Even spills," he said, "can feed compassion." Another time, a bee flew in and danced above the bowls. No one swatted. They simply watched it hover. The bee, too, whispered the nun beside you, has come for sweetness. The meal became more than eating. It became a return to gratitude, to humility, to the sacredness of the ordinary. You wrote later in your journal, "To eat in awareness is to pray without words." And indeed, each bite became a verse in that prayer, a way to say thank you not to someone, but to everything. You never looked at food the same way again. Days passed, and your attention during meals grew even more subtle. You could detect the freshness of a green leaf, the softness of a grain perfectly steamed, but more than flavor. It was the realization of time, how long it had taken the earth to grow this, how easily we consume without seeing. A visiting scholar shared a story in the ancient scriptures. There's a tale of a monk who wept after eating a single apricot. When asked why, he said, "I have wasted so many meals in unconsciousness. Today, for the first time, I tasted the universe. This story stirred something within you. You began to feel each meal as a sacred ceremony. You imagined the hands that harvested, the effort to prepare, the love in the offering. And as you brought the food to your mouth, you began to bow inwardly, not out of ritual, but respect. The monk encouraged you to cook one day. As you chopped vegetables, you found your thoughts wandering. He gently placed a hand on your shoulder. Your thoughts are part of the meal, he said. Cook with care. That changed everything. You stirred with stillness. You added salt with softness. You washed rice as if bathing a child. Serving others became another layer of mindfulness. Watching them receive what you prepared brought a joy deeper than praise. You began to understand dana, the act of giving, as an extension of awareness. Each meal became a meditation. Even washing dishes, the water warm, the plates an offering returned. You remembered the monk's words, "Leave no trace except presence." One evening, as a storm rolled in, you and others shared a silent meal, thunder outside, calm within. The food was simple lentils and bread, yet you felt a fullness beyond flavor. You looked around, faces soft with silence, movements measured. A sense of shared blessing hung in the air. Later that night, you wrote eating like this: I taste not just food, but life itself. I receive not only nutrients, but wisdom. I am fed by the moment. And it was true. Each bite was no longer part of routine. It was part of awakening. You began to reflect. How many meals in your past had you eaten in distraction, in front of screens, in rush, in numbness? And now, how rich was the simplicity? How complete the pause? The monk once said, if you want to change your life, begin with how you eat, not what, but how. Because how you eat is how you live. You took this to heart. Even now, long after leaving the monastery, when you eat, you breathe, you smile, you bow within, you remember. And in this memory, each meal is not just food, it is a return to wholeness. The bell rings in your mind, you lift your spoon, and the world begins again. It began with a walk through the village at the base of the mountain. The sun was soft, filtered through morning mist. You hadn't expected much from the journey, just an errand, a break from routine. But karma does not wait for grand stages to deliver its messages. At the first hut, you met an old woman selling herbs. Her hands were worn like tree bark, her back bent from years of labor, yet her eyes sparkled with light. She offered you a handful of mint and said, I plant kindness, even if the season is dry. You smiled politely, took the herbs, and bowed, but her words followed you, further down. A fisherman mended his net. His movements were rhythmic, precise. You asked how long he'd been fishing. 40 years, he replied, but only recently did I understand what I was really catching. You raised an eyebrow. He smiled. I thought it was fish, but really, I was catching patience, silence, and sometimes my own reflection. Everywhere you turned, people were revealing truths not through sermons, but through how they lived. A child shared half his bread with a stray dog. A potter hummed as she shaped clay, speaking to it as if it were alive. A man with no legs taught children to dance, using only his arms. Back at the monastery, the monk asked, What did you see? You hesitated. Nothing special, but also everything. He nodded. Karma is not loud. It whispers in the ordinary. That night, you couldn't sleep. Your mind revisited the faces from the village. Their presence stayed with you, not because they were exceptional, but because they were real. The next day, you sat in the garden and wrote about them. As you wrote, patterns emerged. The old woman's kindness, the fisherman's patience, the child's instinctive generosity. These weren't isolated acts. They were seeds humbly sown, often unseen, but alive. The monk later shared the story of an unknown pilgrim who once swept leaves outside the temple gates, not for duty, but out of devotion. Years later, a great master said he had learned compassion from watching that sweeping. We rarely know what we plant, or when it will bloom in others, but the field remembers. The idea of karma became less abstract. It wasn't about punishment or reward. It was about resonance, about what lingers when you've walked away. You began to walk through life differently, not seeking to impress, but to express care. You started to see how your smallest actions rippled outward. A word held back in anger, a door held open, a letter written and never sent. Each act became part of your legacy, not grand, but true. And in truth, you found peace. You remembered a nun who once told you, "When I was young, I chased enlightenment. Now I grow vegetables and smile at the rain." You didn't understand her then, but after your walk to the village, you did. Karma was not the thunder. It was the echo. And you, like the villagers, were learning to shape it not with effort, but with intention. One evening, the monk handed you a faded note. It read, "The most powerful karma is how you make others feel when they leave your presence." You folded it and placed it near your heart. Years from now, perhaps no one will remember your name, but they might remember your kindness, your patience, the way you listened without judgment. And if they do, then the path you walked will remain quietly in the steps of others. That is karma, and that is enough. There was a lantern that hung at the monastery gate. No one knew who lit it first, only that it had always been there. Rain or shine, it glowed quietly, never drawing attention, never going out. One morning, the monk pointed to it and said, "That light is what a mindful action looks like. It doesn't boast, but it guides." It was then that you began to see mindfulness not only as a practice on the cushion, but as a living presence in every act, subtle, yet profound. You watched an elder monk fold his robe, not just neatly, but reverently, as if each crease mattered. You observed a young novice offer water to a guest, not as a task, but as an offering. Every gesture, when done with presence, became radiant. One afternoon, you swept the path leading to the temple. A gust of wind undid your work. You sighed. The monk saw this and said, "Sweep not to finish. Sweep to feel the wind." From that day, you began to shift. You poured tea as though it were sacred. You listened to others as if their words were the last rain. You breathed before responding. Small acts, when done with full presence, began to ripple in ways you couldn't see but you could feel. You remembered a time when a visitor broke a bowl. Everyone froze, but the monk smiled and said, "Now it becomes part of our story. No blame, only gentleness. The monk later explained, "Every act plants a vibration. Do it with love, and you plant peace." You began to see how even thoughts were actions. A judgment, silently held, could harden your face. A moment of compassion, quietly felt, could soften the room. In meditation, you explored this further. You asked, what if every breath I take helps shape the world? And in that question, your responsibility turned into reverence. You recalled the story of a laywoman who walked miles each morning just to offer flowers at the temple gate. She never asked to enter. Her devotion was the doorway. The monk told you, she changed more lives with her petals than many with their words. It made sense then. Mindfulness is not about being seen. It's about seeing. Seeing the child struggling to tie their shoe and pausing to help. Seeing the waiter's fatigue and offering a smile. Seeing your own tiredness and choosing rest over criticism. Each moment became an invitation to bring light. You started writing small notes of kindness left in books, on benches, inside cupboards. You didn't sign them. That was the point. It was never about being the source of the light, but about becoming a lantern. You remembered the words, "Mindful actions do not shout, they shine." One day, a dog limped into the monastery grounds. No one chased it away. The monk sat beside it, silent, just presence. The dog slept there that night. It returned every day. Later, someone said, "You healed that dog." The monk replied, "No, I simply didn't add harm." That, too, was light. As you continued your journey, you began to understand mindful action is not a performance. It is alignment between intention, presence, and compassion. You lit incense slowly. With purpose, you tied your shoes with a quiet bow. You laughed, not to impress, but to share space. And in all of this, you glowed. The lantern at the gate still burns. So do you. The room was bare, just a cushion, a mat, and the sound of wind outside. The monk closed the door behind you and said, "Sit and meet what you've been running from." You didn't know what to expect. You thought meditation would be calm, quiet, gentle. Instead, the silence screamed. Your knees ached. Your mind spun stories. The past replayed like a broken reel. But the monk didn't interrupt. He let you sit in the fire. Every breath felt like a confrontation. Every moment a mirror. You saw your judgments, your regrets, the voices you had drowned in distraction. Still, he said, stay. Day after day, you returned to the cushion, and every day, something new surfaced. Anger, sadness, longing. You wanted to escape, but something deeper urged you on. The monk once placed a stone before you. "This is your mind," he said. At first, heavy, but polished by awareness. It becomes clear. You didn't believe him then. You just wanted the pain to stop. But slowly, something shifted. Not the thoughts, they still came. Not the pain, it still visited. But your way of seeing changed. You stopped fighting the noise. You started listening. The monk taught you to name what arose. "This is fear," you'd say, or "here is shame." And each time you named it, the monster shrank. You learned to sit with your demons as if they were old friends, tired, not terrifying. One morning, the silence didn't feel so sharp. It felt spacious. A breeze entered the room, and you smiled. Not because the storm had passed, But because you were learning to dance with the rain, meditation became less about escape and more about embrace. You cried once not from sorrow, but from recognition. You saw the child in you, still afraid, and you held that child in your breath, the monk said. To meet yourself without armor, that is courage, in time. Your breath became an anchor, your thoughts, clouds, your awareness, the sky. You no longer needed to change the weather. You only needed to remember the sky. The room remained bare. The wind still whispered. But you were different. You had not mastered meditation, but you had begun a friendship with yourself. And in that, something beautiful was born. Not peace that silenced life, but peace that included it. As you bowed at the end of one session, the monk placed a hand on your shoulder. Now, he said, you are beginning. And you believed him? The monk once told you, if you want to understand impermanence, begin with your breath. It's the most honest teacher. And so, you sat, spine tall, legs crossed, eyes gently closed. You placed your awareness not on thoughts, not on silence, but on the quiet rise and fall beneath your chest. At first, it was ordinary inhale, exhale, but as minutes passed, you began to feel the subtleties, how no two breaths were the same, how each moment of air entered with a slight variance, some shallow, some deep, some carried tension, others brought ease. And then came the realization each breath was born, lived, and dissolved just like every moment, every joy, every sorrow, every life. You inhaled, and with it came warmth. You exhaled, and with it, release. The cycle never ceased, and you began to see the whole of life mirrored in that quiet loop. The monk whispered, "What is not impermanent?" The question echoed, not just in thought, but through your entire being. You looked back on your memories, childhood friends you no longer knew, lovers who had become strangers, homes you had left behind. You saw your own body as it once was younger, softer. And then you saw your thoughts, always shifting, never stable. Even your identity was changing. The you who first came to the monastery already felt like someone else. One morning, as mist rolled across the hills, you asked the monk, "If everything is impermanent, what can we trust?" He smiled. Impermanence itself. When you stop clinging, you begin to dance with the changing. He then shared the story of the bamboo. Bamboo survives storms because it bends. It is not stubborn. Its strength is in its yielding. You understood then that resistance created suffering. Clinging to permanence was like trying to hold breath forever. Life asked you to inhale, and then to let go. You practiced walking meditation that afternoon. Each step a surrender. You saw the flowers bloom and wilt. You saw the shadow move with the sun. You felt your own emotions rise and fall. The monk encouraged a new practice to observe thoughts as clouds. You are not the cloud, he said. You are the sky that holds it. And so, you sat again. This time, each thought that arose, you named gently fear, hope, doubt, love. You didn't chase or push them away. You watched, and in watching, they softened. Sometimes a painful memory would surface. But instead of fighting, you whispered, "This too is passing." You cried without resistance. You laughed without holding. You breathed without effort. In your journal, you wrote, "Impermanence is not a loss. It's the rhythm of life. You began to find peace, not in stillness, but in the acceptance of motion. You observed the leaves falling in the courtyard, not with sadness, but with reverence. They had lived, they had served, and now they were returning. One evening, during a group meditation, a candle flickered beside you. It danced in the wind, and then it went out. No one moved. The monk simply said, "This too." It was not said in grief, but in grace. You understood that impermanence was not against you. It was the very reason you could grow, change, heal. Without it, nothing would be possible. You remembered your first sit, how painful it was. Now, you could sit for hours, not in escape, but in embrace. The breath had taught you how to live. It had shown you that nothing stayed, and that was the gift. You whispered one morning, "Let me love even this moment, because it will never return." And in that whisper, your heart opened wider than it ever had. The monk bowed to you later, that week. "Now," he said, "you are not meditating, you are living." There once lived a horse that roamed free in the misty mountains that bordered your childhood village, sleek and strong, wild and wise. It was more legend than reality to most. Many tried to tame it, capture its strength for their own. None succeeded. It moved like a whisper between the trees, vanishing before it could be caught. To the villagers, it was simply the wild horse, a symbol of something untouched, untouchable. Your father, a quiet farmer with a slow voice and deep eyes, watched the horse once from a distance. You stood beside him, young, impatient, eager to chase it. He said, "Even the wildest horse has a rhythm. You just have to listen longer." You didn't understand then. You wanted to run, to prove, to win. The world, in your eyes, was something to conquer. You believed strength was in certainty, that the path to peace lay through control. You thought wildness was something to tame, not understand. Years passed. You moved away, driven by ambition. You learned fast, spoke louder, took bigger steps. You succeeded by many standards, but something inside grew restless. The more you controlled, the less you felt. Peace remained elusive, a far-off idea that your pace never allowed you to touch. Then came the call. Your father was ill. You returned home and saw how time had folded him gently. His voice, once solid, had softened. His walk, once firm, was now guided by a cane. Yet his eyes still held that quiet knowing. He asked you to sit, not to talk, just to sit. At first, the silence was unbearable. You itched for action, for distraction. But each day, as you sat with him in the courtyard, something began to shift. He didn't speak much. When he did, his words landed like seeds. One day, watching the sky turn amber at dusk, he asked, "What do you hold so tightly that your hands have forgotten how to open?" You had no answer. Only the silence between you filled the air. Then came the morning the wild horse returned. It entered the village field without fear, grazing quietly among the crops. It looked older, calmer, not broken, but transformed. It didn't run when people watched. It just stood there, unbothered, present. Your father smiled from his chair. "See," he said, "everything returns, but not as it was." That night, he passed away in his sleep. You didn't cry immediately. Instead, you walked. You walked to the edge of the village, to the path that led toward the mountains. You hoped to see the horse again. You didn't, but something inside you felt as though it had been seen. In the weeks that followed, you traveled to a monastery your father once visited. You didn't seek enlightenment, just stillness, a place to breathe. There, you met the monk. He listened to your story, the wild horse, your father's words, your restlessness. He said little at first, only. Your father rode quietly. You ran loudly. Now you are here. The rhythm will return. You began meditating. At first, it was unbearable. Your mind raced, memories surged, your legs hurt, your breath felt foreign. You wanted to quit. But the monk only smiled and said, "Ride with it." So you stayed, you breathed, you fell, returned, and sat again. One morning, after a particularly restless session, the monk handed you a cup of tea and said, "Every mind is a wild horse. We don't tame it with force. We walk beside it until it trusts us." That metaphor became your mantra. You stopped trying to silence your mind. You started listening. Each thought was a hoofbeat, each emotion, a gust of wind across the plain. You began to know the terrain within. During a walking meditation, a breeze passed gently. It carried your father's voice. Even the wildest has rhythm. And in that moment, you understood. You weren't meant to dominate life. You were meant to witness its pulse, its breath, its turning. The monk shared a tale one evening by the fire. A man lost his horse. The villagers cried. "What misfortune," he said. "Maybe." The horse returned, bringing 2 wild companions. "What fortune," they cheered. "Again," he said. "Maybe." His son rode one and broke his leg. "How terrible," they gasped. He said, "Maybe." Soon after, war took every able-bodied man except his son. The monk looked into the flames and said, "Don't name the wind before it has passed." You took that story into your marrow. You stopped labeling every twist of fate. You let moments arrive, unfold, and depart. You no longer chased peace. You allowed it. Years later, you returned to your village. A young boy was chasing a dog with a stick, shouting. You knelt beside him and whispered, "Let it come to you." He stopped. The dog turned, and in silence, approached. You smiled. It wasn't the wild horse, but it carried the same lesson. Everything returns. But not as it was. Life no longer felt like something to harness. It felt like something to accompany. You walked beside it, hand open, breath steady. The wild horse still roams, not only in the hills, but in your thoughts, your losses, your dreams. And when it visits, you no longer chase it. You sit, you breathe, and you ride. The mind always asks why. Why did this happen? Why to me? Why now it seeks answers as if they were keys, hoping that once the right one is found, the door to peace will finally open. But what if the door is not locked? What if there is no key? Because there was never a door at all, only the illusion of one. You first faced this question during a long meditation retreat. The days were simple. Wake up, sit, breathe, walk, eat, repeat. And yet your mind grew louder, each silence filled with memories and regrets, choices and consequences. You began obsessing over moments in your past decisions that hurt others, words you wished to take back, people you never said goodbye to. You sought reasons. You dissected events like a scholar. You blamed, forgave, doubted, explained. But the peace you longed for did not come until one day, while watching a single leaf fall from a tree, something shifted. There was no reason for that leaf to fall at that exact second. And yet, it did. The wind carried it. The moment received it. And life moved on. You realized then perhaps the need to understand is itself the cause of suffering. The monk later confirmed this gently. The mind believes that understanding ends pain. But sometimes, pain only ends when we stop insisting on understanding. You began to observe moments without assigning them meaning. A raindrop landed on your wrist. Instead of thinking how poetic or a sign, you simply felt it. Cold, small, fleeting. That was all. And it was enough. During tea one afternoon, a novice broke a cup. The sound startled everyone, but the monk smiled and continued sipping. "It is already broken," he said. "This is just the moment it lets us know." There was no need to explain why it happened. It did, and the present welcomed it. From then on, you stopped interrogating your past, not out of apathy, but out of reverence. You realized some wounds do not need to be solved, they only need to be held. One evening, you met a woman at the temple gate. She wept for a son she lost in an accident. "I don't understand," she sobbed. "I was careful. I prayed. I loved him." You held her hand. "Love doesn't prevent pain," you whispered, "but it can carry us through it." She looked into your eyes. "But I need a reason." You said nothing, only squeezed her hand. Sometimes, silence is the only honest answer. Over time, you noticed a change. You no longer needed to explain every sadness, every joy. You allowed them. You welcomed their presence, honored their exit. One day, while walking in the forest, you found a broken branch, its wood splintered and raw. You sat beside it, not to ponder why it broke, but to simply be with it. And in that being, you felt whole. You began practicing the same quiet with your inner storms. Anger arose, you no longer asked why now. You simply breathed with it. Sadness visited. You didn't demand it explain itself. You offered it a seat. The monk told you. Each emotion is a guest. Not all guests stay for tea, but all deserve to be seen. You remembered a moment in the garden. A bee landed on your hand, rested, and flew away. No sting, no purpose, no meaning, just a presence, just life passing through. You thought back to your earliest questions, why this suffering? Why this path they no longer burned? They had softened. They had given way to a deeper trust. A child once asked the monk, "Why do trees lose their leaves?" He replied, "Because they trust spring." In that trust, you found a new way to live, not as a seeker of reasons, but as a witness of moments. You looked at your reflection in the temple's still pond. You no longer sought to explain the lines on your face. You smiled at them. They were your story, and it was enough. There is a silence that doesn't come from the absence of sound, but from a stillness so deep that even your thoughts begin to bow before it. That silence came to you, not when you sought peace, but when you finally turned inward, willing to meet everything you had been running from. You had heard of mindfulness. You had read about insight. But it wasn't until you sat with nothing to distract you, no task to do, no one to impress, that the real practice began. At first, it was a confrontation. You sat cross-legged, eyes gently closed, and breathed, but the breath didn't calm you. It brought everything up. Old memories, harsh judgments, regrets like echoes. Your mind was not quiet. It screamed. The monk saw your discomfort and said, "Don't try to silence the mind. Let it speak, but don't argue." That sentence changed your approach. You began to sit not to escape your thoughts, but to witness them. You saw how quickly the mind jumps from fear to fantasy, from resentment to nostalgia. You saw the loops it loved, the stories it replayed, and slowly, without forcing, you began to name them. Here is shame. Here is hope. Here is the need to be seen. Naming them gave them form, and once they had form, they lost their grip. In that process, you discovered the power of awareness, not as a tool to fix, but as a space to hold. You began practicing mindful walking. With each step, you said, "I am here." With each breath, "This is now." You did dishes slowly. You drank tea like it was a blessing. You listened to others not to reply, but to understand. Mindfulness wasn't something you did. It was how you lived. But it was in facing your inner storms that its depth revealed itself. One evening, during meditation, a deep sadness rose. It felt like grief, but without a name. It settled in your chest like a heavy stone. Your instinct was to push it away, but you remembered the monk's words, "What arises belongs." So you stayed. You breathed. You placed your awareness like a warm hand on your own heart, and slowly, the grief softened, not because it left, but because it was no longer alone. You realized then, insight is not always a lightning bolt. Sometimes, it's the gentle unraveling of old knots. You learned to ask yourself kind questions. What is this feeling trying to say? What story am I telling myself? Can I stay one breath longer with this discomfort? And the answers, when they came, didn't always make sense, but they brought relief, not through logic, but through presence. You began journaling after each session, not to analyze, but to reflect. One day, you wrote, "I used to want to control my emotions. Now I just want to hold them with grace." The monk smiled when he read that. He told you a story of a woman who came to him, filled with rage. "I've tried everything," she said. "Still, I hate." He didn't tell her to stop. He gave her a candle and said, "Every time you feel the fire rise, light this. Sit and let it burn without spreading." Weeks passed. The woman returned. "The fire is smaller." She said, "I think it just needed a seat." You carried that story like a mantra. One day, anger visited you. It clutched your gut, clouded your vision. But instead of reacting, you lit a candle, sat, and watched. You didn't fight it. You invited it. And in that act, you became bigger than the emotion. Not stronger, just more spacious. This was the true gift of insight, not in explaining the storm, but in becoming a sky vast enough to hold it. You started recognizing patterns, the old narratives you carried, the roles you played, the armor you wore. You saw how you believed being strong meant being unaffected. But now, you knew strength was in feeling fully and still choosing gentleness. You saw how often your suffering came not from the feeling itself, but from resisting it, fearing it, judging it. You learned to say, "This too, in the temple garden, you watched a lotus bloom, slowly, effortlessly. No rush, no apology, just the quiet unveiling of what was always there. You saw your own heart the same way. Each session of meditation became less about silence, more about seeing. Seeing the child within you, still needing love. Seeing the pride that masked fear. Seeing the loneliness that wore the mask of independence. And in each seeing, a softening. The monk told you, insight is not knowing more, it's seeing clearer. You now understood why they call it practice, not because you are perfecting something, but because you are remembering it, over and over, each breath, a return, each moment, a choice, each feeling, a doorway, and through it all, you remain not the thought, not the emotion, but the one who sees, still, steady, awake. The final lesson didn't arrive with a whisper, nor a great revelation. It came as a quiet presence like sunlight that has always been there, only now noticed. It was the realization that to live fully, one must live freely. And to live freely, one must live without clutching, without clinging, without needing things to be other than they are. The monks called it equanimity, a state of balance. Not from apathy, but from a deep and quiet trust in life's unfolding. You had misunderstood the word before. You thought it meant being indifferent. But as you sat longer in meditation, you came to see that it meant being profoundly open, able to welcome pain and joy, success and failure, pleasure and loss with the same heart. Your journey had taken you through many storms, grief, regret, self-doubt. You had faced the waves, but now, a deeper current called, not just to endure, but to release. The monk once told you, to be free is not to be untouched. It is to be touched deeply and still remain whole. You began practicing this art by letting go in small ways. Letting go of being right in a conversation. Letting go of finishing every task perfectly. Letting go of needing everyone's approval. It was not easy. At times, your ego fought like a wild beast. It wanted recognition. It wanted guarantees. It wanted permanence. But you kept returning to the breath, to the moment, to the gentle, unwavering truth. Nothing can be held forever. You watched leaves fall in autumn without trying to catch them. You let people walk away without chasing. You cried when sorrow came, but you did not hold it hostage. There was a story the monk once shared. A man carried 2 buckets up a hill every day, one perfect, one cracked. The cracked bucket leaked water, and he cursed it. But one day, he noticed flowers blooming along the path where the water had dripped. The monk said, "Let go of your image of perfection. Sometimes, it is your cracks that leave beauty behind." That story stayed with you. You began seeing your scars not as shame, but as maps, proof that you had lived, that you had tried, that you had learned. You began practicing a meditation of letting go. You'd close your eyes and bring to mind someone you resented. You'd breathe in their image, breathe out forgiveness, not because they deserved it, but because you did. You learned to release expectations of others, of yourself, of life. You stopped needing to know the future. You began greeting the unknown as a friend. One morning, you woke before sunrise. The temple was still. You sat on the wooden floor, wrapped in silence, and for the first time, you felt completely unburdened. No longing, no regret, just being. The monk sat beside you. He said nothing, but you both knew. This was equanimity, not a state you achieve once and for all, but one you return to, again and again. Each time you remember that nothing needs to be different for you to be at peace. You carried that truth into daily life. When delays happened, you smiled. When plans changed, you adapted. When pain arose, you sat with it. And when joy came, you received it fully without clinging, knowing it too would pass. You began teaching others not as a master, but as a mirror. You shared your stories, your stumbles, your learnings. You told a young woman who had just been betrayed, "Let this hurt, but let it go too. Your heart is not a prison. It's a river." You told an old man facing illness, "This body is not who you are. Breathe with it. Thank it, but don't hold it too tightly." Each conversation was a practice of compassion without attachment. The monk once described life as a bird resting on your palm. Hold it too tight, it suffocates. Too loose, it flies away. True love holds just enough. And that was your path now to hold gently. Your meditation no longer aimed to transform. It simply helped you remember who you were, beneath all wanting. And you remembered you were spacious, kind, ever-changing, not the storm, but the sky. You walked through the village one evening and saw children playing. One fell, cried, stood up, and ran again. You smiled. That was life. That was you. You had fallen, cried, and stood up, again and again. And now, you ran not from pain, but toward presence. You wrote in your journal that night, "I have no goals now, only intentions, no answers, only questions, carried lightly." The monk read your words and nodded. "You are no longer seeking peace." He said, "You are peace." And in that moment, you believed him. It starts so innocently. A simple, "This shouldn't be happening." A quiet refusal to let the moment be what it is. And from that seed, a storm grows. You pull against time, against people, against yourself, trying to mold reality into a shape that feels safer, more familiar, more fair. But reality does not bend to will. It simply is, the monk once said. The mind that resists becomes its own cage. You didn't understand that at first. You thought resisting meant strength, standing up, changing what must be changed. But over time, through meditation and pain, you learned there is a difference between response and resistance. One is grounded in clarity, the other in fear. You first encountered this lesson during a season of loss, one after another. Things you loved were taken. A job, a friendship, a sense of certainty. Each time, you said, no. You fought, you blamed, you planned and strategized and pushed harder, but nothing changed. And then came the night you collapsed, tired not from what happened, but from the war you were waging inside. You went to the monastery not to find answers, but because you had run out of questions. The monk didn't offer advice. He offered silence. He gave you a room and a bell and said, "When you're ready, sit." And so you did. Every morning, every evening. At first, the silence was unbearable. You heard your resistance louder than ever. "This shouldn't have happened. I don't deserve this. It's not fair." But slowly, like clouds parting. You began to see something beneath the noise, a sadness, a longing, a fear. You sat with them, named them, held them like trembling birds, and as you did, something softened. You remembered the monk's story of the lotus, how it only grows in mud, not in spite of it, but because of it. You stopped saying, "Why me?" You started saying, "This, too." The monk taught you a practice when pain arose. Breathe and bow, not in defeat, but in reverence. This is life. You'd say, "Let me meet it with grace." You began to notice how resistance showed up everywhere. In small things, a traffic jam, a harsh word, a delay. Each time, a tightening. But when you noticed, you breathed, you let go. You realized that the cost of resisting reality is your own peace, and that acceptance is not agreement, it is alignment. It's saying, I may not like this, but I will meet it, fully, openly. Now, you became gentler, with yourself, with others. You stopped needing to win every argument. You stopped needing life to follow your script. And something unexpected happened. You began to feel free. Free not because everything was okay, but because you no longer demanded that it be. You walked through life with hands open, not clenched. One morning, a novice broke a bowl. The sound startled everyone. He apologized again and again. The monk simply said, "It was time." That phrase echoed in you, about the job lost, the friend who left, the changes you feared. It was time. You began to trust the timing of your life. You stopped fighting the current. You began to swim with it. And in that flow, you found a new kind of power. Not the power to change what is, but the power to remain yourself within it. In the monastery's garden, nestled near the oldest stone wall, there stood a bonsai tree. Its trunk, thick and ancient, twisted in deliberate curves, each bend a story, each leaf a whisper of quiet resilience. You passed it every day, never giving it much thought, until the monk stopped you one morning and said, "This tree is a master of surrender." You looked at its form, disciplined, humble, elegant. It didn't grow wild. He continued, but it didn't resist. Either. It shaped itself according to hands, wind, time, and yet, it thrives. That was your first lesson in the art of Tui Tuan Duyen Sin, yielding to causes and conditions. Before that, your life had been a fight against what was. You sought control over events, people, outcomes. You mistook willpower for wisdom. But life, like the bonsai, doesn't grow in straight lines. It curves. It adapts. The monk invited you to care for the bonsai. Each morning, you would water it, trim gently, remove fallen leaves. It wasn't gardening. It was meditation. You noticed how the tree did not complain when trimmed. It did not recoil when touched. Instead, it simply responded. You began to see how your mind resisted change, when plans shifted, when people disappointed, when life unfolded differently than you imagined. You gripped tightly. You argued with reality. But now, with the bonsai as your teacher, you softened. One day, during a particularly quiet morning, the monk sat beside you and whispered, "Life shapes us, as wind shapes stone, not in haste, but with patience." You remembered a childhood story, a boy who tried to straighten a young sapling each day, pulling it upward. Eventually, The tree died, but the tree left alone and gently supported, bent toward the sun and lived. The monk said, "You don't force growth, you invite it." You applied this to your relationships. Instead of correcting others, you listened. Instead of controlling, you supported. You watched how people, like trees, thrive when given space and sunlight. You began to trust the intelligence of life. It no longer seemed chaotic. It was mysterious, yes, but intelligent, guided by invisible threads of cause and condition. One afternoon, a storm came. The bonsai trembled but didn't break. Its roots were deep, its form flexible. The next morning, it stood still, glittering with raindrops. You whispered, "This too is strength." You sat beside it often, reflecting on your own bends, mistakes, failures, wounds. You no longer saw them as flaws. They were the shaping forces of your becoming. You wrote in your journal, "My life is not crooked. It is cultivated." The monk read it and nodded. Good. Now live like that. You let go of rigid goals. You welcomed surprises. A friend you hadn't heard from returned. A job you thought lost was replaced by something truer. Each time, you marveled at life's ability to rearrange itself. You stopped saying, "This is not what I planned." You started saying, "Let's see where this goes." You taught others the same. You told a grieving mother, "Bend, don't break. Let the sorrow pass through you, not define you." You told a young monk afraid of failure, "Every twist is a teaching." And in guiding them, you deepened your own practice. You meditated beneath the bonsai. You traced its branches with your eyes. You breathed with its stillness. You felt its teachings in your bones. A traveling monk once asked you, "What is your lineage?" You pointed to the bonsai. "That," you said, "is my tradition." He laughed gently. "Then you have understood." You watched how the tree never rushed its bloom. Seasons came, and it responded not with fear, but with form. In spring, it offered leaves. In fall, it let them go. In winter, it stood bare, not dead, but waiting. You began living seasonally, too. There were days to act and days to rest, days to speak and days to listen, days to grieve and days to laugh. You stopped pushing. You began aligning. You met people with more kindness. You no longer rushed them toward insight. You sat with their silence. You trusted their timing. You understood that healing is not linear. It spirals, like the tree's branches. It bends, pauses, returns. You traveled to a nearby village once, asked to speak to a group of teachers. You told them, "A student is like a bonsai. Don't force their branches, tend their roots." They nodded slowly. Some cried. You left quietly, your words like water in their soil. At the monastery, a child began visiting you daily. He was curious but restless. One day, he snapped a twig off the bonsai. He froze in fear. You knelt, took his hand, and helped him plant it in the soil beside. "We'll grow another." You said, "Things break. That's how new things begin." He smiled. You knew in that moment your teaching was alive. Years passed. You aged. Your steps slowed, but your presence deepened. And when the monk who once guided you passed, you sat alone by the bonsai and wept, not with despair, but with reverence. He too had shaped you, not with force, but with presence, not with answers, but with space. You wrote one final line in your journal. I am not a master. I am a garden, and the tree, ever still, whispered yes. It was inevitable. Change was the one constant that visited each season, each life, each breath. You knew it intellectually. Books had said it. Teachers had echoed it. Even the trees had shown it through falling leaves and blooming buds. And yet, when change knocked on your door unexpected, uninvited, you flinched. You had built a life around predictability. Routines were your refuge. Planning gave you power. But the day your father passed, unannounced like a shadow at dusk, something shattered. Not just your heart, but your illusion of control. You wandered into the monastery carrying more than grief. You carried a desire to freeze time, to cling to what once was. But the monk met you with gentleness. He didn't try to explain loss. He offered tea, a seat, silence. And from that silence, you began a new relationship with change. You watched the temple garden every day. One afternoon, you noticed a caterpillar spinning silk. Days later, you found the cocoon empty. The butterfly was gone. A monk whispered, "It didn't die. It transformed." That phrase echoed in you. You began to see change not as destruction, but as metamorphosis. During meditation, you felt your resistance. Every thought tried to fix, to remember, to bring back what was lost. But with each breath, you softened. You began studying the teachings of impermanence not just in sutras, but in life. The tea cooled, the candles burned out, the rice hardened if uneaten. Everything changed, and so did you. You found joy not in holding, but in witnessing, in being present as life unfolded. You no longer clung to moments. You bowed to them. A young nun once asked, "How do I not fear change?" You replied, "By trusting its rhythm. Change is not chaos. It is choreography." You shared your own story with her. The death of your father, the waves of grief, the days you could not breathe, and how, slowly, breath returned. You told her, wisdom is not in avoiding change. It's in aligning with it. She asked, "What if change hurts?" You smiled. "It often does. That's how it wakes us." You practiced embracing change deliberately. You switched your routine, sat in a new place each day, ate slower, walked new paths, spoke less, listened more. Each small act rewired your nervous system. From defense to openness, you told yourself, "I am a river, not a rock." And in that flow, life became less of a battlefield and more of a pilgrimage. You watched monks adapt with ease. When rain interrupted a task, they smiled. When plans shifted, they bowed. Their hearts were not tied to the outcome, but to presence. You learned to do the same. You stopped resisting your aging face. You welcomed the gray hairs, the slower pace. You thanked your body not for its perfection, but for its service. One day, a storm destroyed part of the temple's roof. Many gasped. The monk said, "Let's rebuild, maybe better." That night, you sat under the broken beams and looked at the stars. You realized if not for the damage, you wouldn't have seen the sky. Loss, too, revealed beauty. You wrote, "Change is not the thief. It is the revealer." You shared this with villagers who feared a coming drought. The land will change. You said, "So must we. Let us plant differently, gather differently, think differently." They listened, not because you had answers, but because you embodied calm. The monk once said, "Wisdom is not knowing the path. It's trusting your feet. You now trusted yours, and you guided others, not by leading them to still water, but by teaching them to swim in waves. You began seeing every goodbye as a gateway, every ending as a doorway, every loss as a lesson, and in each moment of uncertainty, you asked, 'What is life inviting now?' You became less of a fixer, more of a witness. When a friend cried over divorce, you didn't offer solutions. You held her hand and said, 'This is part of your becoming.' When a student failed an exam, you whispered, 'The flower doesn't bloom every day, but it still grows.' You didn't promise that things would go back to how they were. You promised they would evolve, and that promise, born from your own transformation, gave hope. The monks gave you a new name, Dong Bien, the flowing one. You carried it like a torch, not to lead, but to light the unknown. You stood on the monastery's highest hilltop, watching clouds drift across the vast blue sky. A monk stood beside you and asked, "Do you know what the sky holds?" You replied, "Weather." He smiled. "No, it holds karma." At first, you thought he was speaking metaphorically. But as days passed, you began to understand the sky above mirrors the patterns within. Every gust of wind, every drifting cloud, every ray of light is like the trace of karma causes and conditions weaving an invisible tapestry. You began to watch more closely, not just the sky, but everything. The way the garden bloomed after being tended, the way harsh words echoed long after they were spoken, the way small acts of kindness returned in unexpected forms. The monk said, "Everything is speaking. We just need to listen." You began to see the world as a dialogue, a living, breathing communication of energy, intention, and action. When you walked, the earth responded with softness. When you watered the plants, they opened. When you rushed, the tea spilled. When you slowed, even the rice seemed to cook sweeter. This was karma, not as punishment or reward, but as relationship. The monk once led you through the village. He bowed to every elder, thanked every child, smiled at every passerby. You asked, "Why such reverence?" He said, "They are all part of my sky. Their presence speaks my past, and my presence shapes their future." You realize then that karma isn't fixed. It flows, it evolves, it transforms with every thought, word, and deed. One day, a woman came to the temple in tears. She believed she was cursed. Everything in her life was falling apart. The monk handed her a broom. "Clean the courtyard." He said, confused. She did. For days, she swept, slowly, her heart calmed. She began to smile. When she finished, she bowed and asked, "Why did this help?" The monk said, "You weren't cursed. You were clogged. Cleaning cleared not just the dust, but your story. You learned from this." Karma is not only about action, it's also about perception. The stories we repeat become the skies we live under. You started to question your stories. Am I a victim or a student? Is this punishment or a path? Is this coincidence or consequence? And in questioning, you found space. You recalled the monk's teaching. The sky does not argue with the storm. It makes room. So did you. You stopped blaming your past. You stopped fearing your future. You began planting new seeds of patience, of mindfulness, of compassion, and you watched as your sky slowly changed. The winds grew gentler, the clouds moved slower, the sun returned. You journaled, "I used to dread karma. Now I dialogue with it." You spoke to your actions like old friends. You honored their origins. You took responsibility, not out of guilt, but out of love. You helped others do the same. You told a man angry at his broken marriage, "This is not the end. This is the unfolding of a longer story." What will you write next? You told a young monk afraid of failure, "Every stumble leaves a message. Step softer, not smaller." You taught that karma is not a weight, it's a whisper, guiding, echoing, gently shaping. One evening, you watched birds fly across the sky in perfect formation. The monk beside you said, "That's karma, two coordinated cause and shared consequence." You wept at the beauty of it. You had spent years trying to escape your past. Now, you welcomed it. You saw it not as baggage, but as background, a landscape from which you could grow. The monk gifted you a calligraphy Ngyep Nu Troi, Kong Che, Kong Yu, Chimo. You hung it in your room. Each morning, it reminded you, nothing is fixed. Everything is formative. When doubts arose, you meditated on the sky. When anger rose, you wrote letters you never sent. When shame visited, you sat in the garden and let the wind speak. You healed not by forgetting, but by including. And your life became less about avoiding pain and more about translating it. You became fluent in the language of all things. The first time you arrived at the monastery, your footsteps carried more than your body. They carried expectations, questions, wounds. You imagine that in this sacred space, a final answer would emerge, a truth so clear it would silence the restless movements within you. You believed enlightenment was a destination, a kind of spiritual finish line where suffering evaporates and certainty reigns. But nothing was quite as you had imagined. The monk who welcomed you didn't speak of goals. He didn't hand you a map or a list of steps. Instead, he placed a broom in your hand and said, "Begin here." So, you swept the stone courtyard, not knowing that you were already walking the Dharma path. Each grain of dust carried a lesson. Each movement of your arm shaped the way forward. And slowly, without realizing it, you began to unlearn the idea that the spiritual life was a summit to reach. In Dharma, the monk later said, "There is no destination, only deepening." You found those words confusing at first. They felt vague, evasive. You had come for concrete answers. But as the days passed and your gaze softened, you started to see what he meant. You began to notice how you walked. At first, your strides were hurried, each step driven by some invisible urgency. You wanted results, insights, transformation. But the more you walked the same path past the bamboo grove, beneath the rustling pines, the more you began to settle into the walking itself. You wrote in your journal, "I am not here to arrive. I am here to attend." The mornings became sacred. You rose before the sun, sat in silence, bowed to the breath. The same rituals, repeated daily, became less about perfection and more about presence. The monks taught not through lectures, but through their way of being. You watched them cook rice as if it were a prayer, fold robes with the tenderness of a mother wrapping a child, sit still for hours without fidgeting, not out of effort, but out of ease. You once asked, "How will I know I've awakened?" the abbot replied. When you stop asking, it took months before those words made sense. At first, they irritated you. You were someone who sought progress, signs, validation. But then came the day when you walked to the garden simply to see the lilies bloom, not to find meaning, but to meet the moment. And something inside you loosened. You began to teach the younger novices not through explanation, but through invitation. You asked questions. What if the path isn't taking you somewhere else? What if it's revealing where you already are? What if practice is not becoming, but being? Some nodded in understanding. Others stayed silent. One cried. You shared with them the story your teacher once told. A traveler climbed a great mountain to find the wisest sage. Upon reaching the peak, exhausted, he asked, "What is the secret of awakening?" The sage answered, "Eat when hungry, rest when tired." The traveler frowned. "But doesn't everyone do that?" The sage replied, "No. Most eat with distraction and sleep with worry. That story lived in you. Enlightenment, you began to see, wasn't about transcending humanity. It was about inhabiting it fully, to walk, eat, speak, breathe not with absent-mindedness, but with sacred care. The path became a rhythm. The days repeated, yet never felt the same, because you weren't the same. Each bow deepened, each breath softened, each silence became richer. You learned to listen, not just to words, but to space, to tone, to the hush between sentences. The Dharma began to speak through wind, through the creak of floorboards, through the smile of the old gardener. One day, while meditating by the stream, you watched a leaf float by. It danced on the current, graceful, unresisting. You whispered, "That is enough." The idea of becoming someone dissolved. You were not here to improve. You were here to remember, to return, to be. You told a group of visitors, "There is no enlightenment outside this moment. Everything else is memory or fantasy." They asked, "But shouldn't we try to be better?" You replied, "Be here, and you will become what you are." You stopped measuring progress. Some days, your mind was quiet. Others, it was stormy. But both were included. Both were walked with. You learned to bow to joy and bow to sorrow, to hold both as sacred guests. The monk said, "The path bows back when we bow to it." That night, you lit a single candle and wrote, "This journey isn't upward, it's inward." You began seeing the world differently. A broken cup was no longer a mistake. It was an invitation to gentleness. A rude remark was not a threat, but a bell calling you back to patience. You told a grieving friend, "This pain is not outside the path. It is the path." You met a stranger who asked, "How long have you practiced?" You smiled. "Since this breath." That was the truth. The practice had no beginning, no end, only deepening. You met the abbot one morning as he swept the corridor. He looked up and said, "Still walking?" You bowed. "Still arriving?" He laughed. "Good. Then you have understood." And you had, not in the way you once imagined. There was no final revelation, no fireworks, no voice from the sky. Just this moment, this breath, this step. The practice was not a vehicle to take you elsewhere. It was the destination, dressed as the journey. You began calling it the pathless path, not because it led nowhere, but because it led to now. You wrote, Each moment is the temple. Each act is the prayer. Each breath is the bell. The day you first encountered the teachings on karma, they felt dense and faded. Karma was described as an invisible ledger, where every action, thought, or word was etched into a cosmic memory. It seemed unshakable, vast, and inevitable to your younger self. It sounded like a prison disguised as a philosophy, a judgment cloaked in spirituality. And that judgment followed you, even when you turned your gaze toward healing. But as you stepped deeper into the rhythms of monastic life, the silence, the stillness, the slow breath of the dawn, you began to perceive karma not as a sentence, but as a seed, not as punishment, but as possibility. The monk once said, "Karma is not the shadow behind you. It is the light you shape with your hands." You had seen karma in the curves of your mother's back, bowed by years of worry and sacrifice. You saw it in the gentleness of your grandfather, whose kindness softened even the sharpest misfortune. And you began to understand karma was not what happened to the Misuon, it was how they responded. It was how they chose to meet the world. Every morning, you swept the meditation hall. At first, it felt menial. But one day, a monk stopped beside you and said, "Every sweep shapes your future." You watched as dust stirred, settled, disappeared. The sweep was not just clearing the floor, it was clearing your mind, your intentions, your heart. And each motion was a microcosm of karma effort. Result: release. Over time, you became aware of subtler movements, the sharp edge in your voice when impatient, the tremble of your hands when frightened, the tightness in your chest when shamed. Karma lived there, too, not just in big life events, but in the tiny ripples of presence and reaction. A traveler once came to the monastery, burdened by regret. He had hurt his brother with words he couldn't take back. He asked the monk, "Is karma real if I never meant to cause harm?" The monk replied, "Intent is a wind. It directs the arrow, but once released, the arrow flies, and where it lands, it leaves a mark." The traveler lowered his eyes. "Then I am doomed." But the monk smiled gently. "No, because the next arrow is still in your hand. You never forgot that." Karma was continuity, but also choice. You began practicing not just right action, but right remembrance, not just avoidance of harm, but cultivation of insight. You taught a novice, trembling with guilt for forgetting his chanting. This moment is fresh. Karma is not a punishment, it's a pattern, and patterns can be rewoven. You began bowing more deeply, not out of ritual, but reverence. You bowed to the moment, to your breath, to the karma that brought you to this path. One spring, you planted vegetables in the temple garden. You buried seeds with care, watered them mindfully, protected them from birds. And when the first shoots broke through the soil, you smiled. Karma, you realized, was not mystical. It was this, an elder monk once said. We are gardeners. Every thought is a seed. Every word is water. Every action is sunlight or shade. That metaphor lived in you. When anger visited, you asked, "What am I watering?" When joy arrived, you asked, "Can I share this light?" A widow came seeking solace. She said, "I must have done something terrible to deserve this loss." You looked into her grief and replied, "Karma is not math, it's music, and this pain, while deep, is not a punishment. It's a note, part of a song still being written." She wept not from despair, but from relief. The monks began asking you to speak to guests. You didn't use doctrine. You told stories. You told of a bird nesting in a broken branch, of a fisherman who gave his last catch to a starving dog, of a child who forgave her mother in silence. Each story held a truth. Karma was not about control. It was about care. You met people hardened by their past. You offered them not escape, but space, a new way to look, a different light. The monk once said, "Suffering is not karma's cruelty. It is its bell. It calls us home." So you listened, and you helped others listen. When a young woman confessed her shame for past choices, you didn't correct her. You held her hand and said, "If karma binds, compassion unties." She asked, "Can I start over?" You nodded. Every breath is a beginning. You stopped fearing your mistakes. You studied them. You let them teach you. One night, while meditating beneath the stars, you whispered, "I am not here to repay. I am here to reshape." And the stars shimmered in agreement. Karma was not the past chasing you. It was the present revealing you. You wrote in your journal, "Even suffering has soft eyes when seen without blame." You shared this with those who visited, with those who stayed, with those who left. And each time, you watched something soften sometimes in them, sometimes in you. A monk once remarked, "You speak of karma like a poet." You smiled, because karma is a story, and every story needs a choice. You kept choosing to be present, to be kind, to be quiet when silence healed more than words, to act not from reaction, but from intention. You became a field, fertile and open, ready for whatever life offered, ready to meet it with care. And as you aged, you no longer asked, "What did I do to deserve this?" You asked, "What is this moment asking of me?" And in that question lived freedom. It begins not with a grand revelation, but with a quiet pause, a moment in which the world slows, and your breath becomes the only sound you trust. That morning, wrapped in the mist of dawn, you sat beneath the Bodhi tree replica in the monastery garden, pondering a phrase that the elder monk had once etched into your memory. All phenomena arise in dependence upon conditions. You had heard the teaching before, pratitya samutpada, the law of dependent origination. But it was more than theory. It was the thread that wove together suffering and release, illusion and clarity, ignorance and wisdom. It was not a doctrine to memorize. It was a mirror to see life. The monk once said, "Nothing exists on its own. Everything leans." You began to observe the leaning. When a flower blossomed, you saw the sunlight, the rain, the soil, the hand that planted it. When you sat for tea, you tasted not just leaves, but generations of pickers, traditions of brewing, the hands of the novice who poured it. You began to see that nothing stood in isolation, not joy, not sorrow, not even your pain. Your pain had a story, a cause, a seed. It had 1,000 conditions behind it, some ancient, some new, some known, some hidden, and suddenly, blame began to dissolve. You could no longer say, "This is all your fault," or even, "This is all mine." Instead, you whispered, "This is the fruit of many roots." One evening, the monk took you to the old stone wall behind the hall. "Look closely," he said. You did, Moss grew in the cracks. Water had softened the stones. Tiny insects moved silently. "What do you see?" he asked. You answered, "Change." He nodded. "Interbeing." That word stayed with you, interbeing. It meant nothing exists independently, that we are made of non-us elements, that your smile holds your grandmother's laughter, that your sorrow echoes your ancestors' silence. You recalled your childhood, how your father's silence after long days shaped your view of love, how your mother's tired hands shaped your work ethic, how your teacher's brief kindness shaped your belief in your own worth. Each moment, a mosaic of conditions. The law of dependent origination was not distant. It was intimate. It touched how you ate, how you argued, how you dreamed. You stopped asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and started asking, "What are the conditions that gave rise to this?" You no longer saw the world as a battlefield, but as a field alive, responsive, conditional. A young novice once asked, "If nothing exists independently, is anything real?" You replied, "Real, yes, but not fixed, not separate." They frowned. You handed them a glass of water. This water depends on cloud, heat, sea, time, kindness, and now it quenches your thirst. Is it real? They nodded. You smiled. So is your sadness. So is your joy. Both are clouds. Passing through, you began teaching others not to resist life, but to read it, to read the web of causes and conditions that made each moment arise. And in that reading, they began to find release. Because when we see the web, we stop pulling its threads so tightly. It begins not with a grand revelation, but with a quiet pause, a moment in which the world slows, and your breath becomes the only sound you trust. That morning, wrapped in the mist of dawn, you sat beneath the Bodhi tree replica in the monastery garden, pondering a phrase that the elder monk had once etched into your memory. All phenomena arise in dependence upon conditions. You had heard the teaching before, Pratyasamutpada, the law of dependent origination, but it was more than theory. It was the thread that wove together suffering and release, illusion and clarity, ignorance and wisdom. It was not a doctrine to memorize. It was a mirror to see life. The monk once said, "Nothing exists on its own. Everything leans." And so, you began to notice the leaning. A flower does not bloom alone. It carries within it the cloud, the sun, the gardener's care, and the soft whisper of the soil. When you drank a cup of tea, it wasn't just tea. It was a legacy of pickers, potters, and the child who brought you the kettle. Nothing stood isolated. You began to reflect on your own life. Was your smile your own? Or did it also belong to your grandmother? Whose stories lulled you to sleep? Did your grief arise solely from within? Or did it carry the voice of your father, who rarely said, "Sorry," and the silence of a friend who left without goodbye? Everything was a meeting point, not just of people or places, but of memories, energies, conditions. You remembered being a child, sitting alone in your room after being scolded. That pain, so small and sharp, was shaped not just by the moment, but by the many times love had felt conditional. It was not one person's fault. It was the fruit of many roots. And suddenly, compassion emerged not just for others, but for yourself. The monk guided you to the garden and asked, "What do you see?" You looked, leaves trembling in the wind, shadows dancing on the path, dew sparkling like quiet tears. You answered, "Change, connection." He nodded. "Dependent origination. Everything is made of everything else." You're suffering. 2. Had conditions? And knowing those conditions meant you were not trapped. You were participating. If suffering could arise from causes, then so could peace. You began sitting with your breath more gently, not as a task, but as a meeting with your body, your ancestors, your hopes. You watched how one thought led to another, how a sound could trigger memory, how memory could become emotion. And you began to smile, not because everything was solved, but because everything was held, interbeing. The monk called it the water in the cloud in your tea, the tea in your joy, the joy in your tears. You shared this with others. A woman grieving her child, a man tormented by failure, a teenager feeling unseen. You told them, you are not broken, you are becoming, and everything that meets you is shaping you, but you are shaping it. 2. And as you spoke, you saw their eyes soften. You wrote, understanding. The web does not entangle you, it frees you. You once stood on a cliff overlooking a valley veiled in mist. The wind tugged gently at your robe, and the world below seemed quiet, still, and somehow perfect. But then a step down the path. The wind shifted, and the valley looked different, less serene, more fragile. The mountain hadn't changed. You had. Your angle, your perspective, had shifted, and so had the truth it offered. The monk once said, "Perspective is not illusion, it's partiality." And so began your journey into the complexity of human experience, why injustice burns, why doubt clings, why some wounds refuse to heal. You met a man who had lost everything. "Why did this happen to me?" he asked. His eyes were not looking for theory. They were looking for relief, and you could not give him a reason, only a path. So you sat beside him and said, "Let's walk backward together, not in time, but in understanding. Let's not ask why, but how." He looked puzzled. You said, "What were the winds that brought you here? The choices, the systems, the silences," and slowly, he began to name them not as blame, but as insight, a childhood of poverty, a system that favored some and crushed others, a decision made in fear, a moment of silence when he should have spoken. And in that mapping, he began to breathe again. You wrote, "Justice without understanding becomes vengeance, and understanding begins with seeing broadly." You met a woman who doubted her worth. She had been told her voice was too loud, her grief too heavy, her joy too much. She had folded herself small. You told her, "You are not too much. You are too seen for others' comfort." She cried. And in those tears was a shift, a cracking open. The law of dependent origination does not just explain events, it reveals systems, biases, blindness, and once revealed, it offers the beginning of change. You saw how suffering compounded suffering, a mistake punished too harshly, a cry ignored, a truth denied, one event growing roots, feeding the next. So you began to teach not just causes, but conditions, and not just personal, but structural. The monk once said, "We do not rise alone, and we do not fall alone." You remembered a village you visited. They told stories not of heroes, but of hands joined in hardship. They believed no one was saved unless all were. You began using the phrase, "shift the lens." When someone said, "I failed," you said. Or perhaps the structure failed you. When someone said, I am broken, you said. Or perhaps you are whole in a world that fragments. When someone said, it's my fault, you said. Or maybe it's time to ask, whose benefit kept you silent? You did not absolve responsibility. You widened it. Because karma is not blame. It is pattern. And breaking patterns begins with seeing them. And so, your practice deepened, not just in silence, but in listening. To voices long silenced, to truths hard to hold, to histories whispered in shame. You sat in circles with those labeled wrong. You sat in temples with those seeking right. You held both with the same breath. And you asked, what are we refusing to see because we are afraid of what it asks of us? No answer came quickly, but in the asking, the web began to show its threads. It was a morning heavy with silence, the kind that seemed to echo louder than sound. The old master walked slowly through the garden, his sandals barely brushing the ground. Behind him, a student followed, head lowered, carrying a single question in his heart. Why does life not make sense? The student had lost something dear, a relationship, a dream, a part of himself, and now everything seemed cruel and disjointed. Karma felt arbitrary. Suffering felt unjustified. No teaching seemed to soothe his ache. They reached the tea house. The master gestured for him to sit. Without a word, he began to prepare tea. Slow, measured, intentional. The kettle hissed. The cups were placed, and the scent of jasmine filled the air. As he poured, the master kept pouring and kept pouring. The cup overflowed. Stop, cried the student. It's already full. The master paused. Like your mind. The student blinked. But I came for answers. And yet, you bring your answers with you. The master replied. The moment cracked something open. It wasn't a lesson in logic. It was a lesson in receiving. Over the following weeks, the student stayed close to the master, not for answers, but for understanding. He learned that dependent origination was not a puzzle to be solved, but a path to be walked. Every action, every thought, every breath was part of a web. He saw how his sorrow was tied not just to the loss itself, but to his clinging, his stories, his resistance. He asked, so karma isn't punishment? The master smiled. Karma is memory in motion. He watched a bird building a nest and thought of his mother's quiet hands braiding his hair. He saw a leaf fall and remembered how letting go always felt like failure. The master said, everything you notice is a teacher. They visited a temple. A monk there swept the floor with fierce attention. The student asked, why so careful? The monk replied, this floor holds generations. My sweeping honors them. In that, the student saw a new dimension to karma, not only as consequence, but as care, as continuity. He began bowing more deeply, eating more slowly, listening more fully. He asked the master one night, if all things arise together, do we have choice? The master answered, choice is not in the arising, it is in the response. So he practiced the pause, the breath before the word, the stillness before the step. One morning, he found a teacup cracked. He picked it up to throw away. The master stopped him. Why discard what still holds? He looked again. The crack shimmered in the light. The cup was not broken. It was beautiful in its imperfection. And he realized he, too, could still hold. He began teaching others, not with lectures, but with tea, with stories, with silence. He said, "Your pain is not yours alone. It is part of a tapestry, and in seeing the threads, you will find the strength to weave anew." They asked him, "Will it ever stop hurting?" He replied, "That is not the question. Ask instead, will I learn to hold it differently?" And in that shift, healing began. It was a sound so small, you could have missed it. The clink of a spoon against a bowl, the scrape of rice at the bottom of a pot. But to you, it was the bell of awakening. That day, you stood in the kitchen of the monastery, preparing breakfast, not as a duty, but as a meditation. The steam curled like incense, the oil crackled in greeting, and the vegetables yielded softly under your hands. This was not just cooking, it was communion. You remembered the words of the teacher. The truth does not hide in scripture alone. It lives in your rice, your footsteps, your breath. So you watched each movement, not with control, but with care. The cutting, the washing, the stirring, all of it became a prayer. And somewhere in that rhythm, you saw it dependent origination, unfolding not in abstraction, but in garlic and ginger and grain. One day, a novice dropped a bowl. It shattered. He froze. You walked over slowly and picked up the pieces. "Everything breaks," you said gently, "and everything comes from something." He looked confused. You said, "That bowl came from clay, and the clay from the mountain, and the mountain from time, and time from..." He finished, "From everything." You smiled. Exactly. You began to keep a small journal, not of profound teachings, but of small moments. A bee in the window, a child's laugh in the temple courtyard, the way silence settled after evening chanting. Each entry became a verse in the great poem of life, each line a thread in the net of conditions. You met a woman who said, "I don't understand philosophy. It's too hard." You offered her a raisin and said, "Chew this slowly." She did, and tears welled in her eyes. "Why am I crying?" she asked. "Because you tasted your grandmother's hands," you said, "and because the sun lives in that raisin." Understanding had arrived not through theory, but through presence. You walked more slowly. You spoke more kindly. You gave thanks not just for blessings, but for lessons. You began to see that even suffering had a scent, a color, a lineage, that even your anger was not yours alone. It carried the voice of your father, the silence of your mother, the wound of your ancestors. And in seeing that, you softened. You told a young monk, "Every small thing contains all things. There's no such thing as just." He asked, "Then is brushing my teeth also sacred?" You nodded. "Especially that." And together, you brushed your teeth with reverence. One evening, as the sky turned the color of ash, you sat by the river and watched leaves drift by. A child nearby threw stones into the water. Laughing as the ripples danced, you saw yourself in that child, in the joy, the innocence, the fleetingness. You whispered, "I am also made of leaves and laughter." The law of dependent origination no longer felt like doctrine. It felt like devotion. You told your students, "Do not wait for enlightenment. Let your tea teach you. Let your tired feet teach you. Let your mistakes teach you." And they did. One morning, a student brought you a broken watch. "It doesn't tick anymore," he said. You turned it over and replied, "Then let it teach you time in a new way. And he smiled, as if he understood. It wasn't the chanting that awakened you one morning. It was the crow's call outside your window, a rough, raw sound that split the dawn like a crack in stone. For some reason, it made you sit upright, alert. A strange clarity filled the air, and you remembered the words, "Every moment is a seed. What will you plant today, that day?" You walked differently, not faster or slower, but more awake. You noticed the way your foot landed, how your breath synced with the wind, how a novice swept the courtyard with both hands, holding the broom as if it were a bow to life itself. Karma, you had once believed, was about retribution, do good, receive good, do harm, suffer. But the monastery taught something different. Karma was more like a river. It flowed, curved, absorbed. It responded to terrain, and most of all, it remembered, but not as punishment, rather as potential. You began each morning by lighting a candle and bowing not to an altar, but to intention. "May today be well planted," you whispered. There was a young woman who had come to the temple, burdened by mistakes. She had lied. She said she had hurt others deeply. "Am I now condemned?" she asked. You sat with her beside the garden. "Do you see that tree?" you asked. "It used to grow crooked. We guided it, little by little, not by force, by presence. So karma can be reshaped," she whispered. "Every breath is a new shaping." You said you gave her a small task to care for the temple's cats. Feed them, bathe them, speak kindly. She did, and slowly, she began to speak kindly to herself. You wrote, "Karma is not the enemy of freedom. It is the reminder that freedom is earned, moment by moment." You met a man tormented by guilt. He had abandoned someone once. Now he couldn't trust his own kindness. You gave him a broom. Clean the same step every day. You said, "He did, for 100 days. One day he asked, 'What am I cleaning?' You answered, 'The story you believe about yourself.' And he wept not from sadness, but from relief. You taught others to rewrite their stories, not by denying the past, but by responding to the present with care. You said, "You are not a mistake. You are a gardener of your own future." And in that shift from victim to cultivator, something bloomed. You practiced this yourself. When anger rose, you breathed. When judgment whispered, you listened instead. When fear arrived, you made tea. You whispered often, "Let me meet this moment well." And when you failed, you bowed, not in shame, in humility. Because even mistakes, when held with awareness, become teachings. You wrote, "What I do now shapes what I will become." This is power. This is tenderness. The monk said, "Karma is not a debt. It is a direction." So you walked not perfectly, but deliberately. You offered this to all who came, the mother grieving a lost son, the addict seeking another chance, the soldier seeking peace. To each, you offered not absolution, but tools. Plant something. You said, and they did, and something grew. There is a moment, not marked by thunder or ceremony, when the light shifts just enough to reveal what was always there. It is the quiet realization, the kind that doesn't announce itself but folds gently into your breath. One day, while pouring tea, you noticed your hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from awe. You were holding the present. The present, you learned, is not simply now. It is the culmination of every seed, every sigh, every silence. And in this realization, something within you stirred a presence deeper than emotion, more stable than thought, a kind of seeing that had no observer. It was the Buddha nature the texts had spoken of. But now it had your face. A student once asked, "Where's the Buddha?" You replied, "In your hunger, in your hope, in your hesitation." They frowned. "That doesn't sound like enlightenment." You smiled, "Because it isn't an escape, it's a return." You began to sit not to transcend, but to touch the ache in your chest, the tiredness in your legs, the joy that came uninvited. And in that touching, you saw clearly nothing needed fixing, everything needed seeing. The teachings say, see the true nature of things, and suffering falls away. But you discovered a subtler truth when you truly see. Suffering still exists, but it no longer defines you. You once wept while watching a leaf fall, not from sadness, but from recognition. The leaf did not resist. It floated, surrendered, danced into the ground, and you whispered, "May I fall so gracefully." You began inviting others to sit with you, not in pursuit of answers, but of intimacy, with themselves, with the breath, with the ache and the awe. One evening, a man sat beside you, ashamed of his restlessness. You told him, "Restlessness is the wind. Do not chase it. Watch it. Let it move. You are the sky." And he closed his eyes and breathed, and for a moment, he remembered. You remembered, too, every teaching, every bell. Every step was pointing not away from life, but into it. You wrote, "The Buddha is not found in distant realms, but in the way you tie your shoes, in how you speak to a stranger, in your patience at a red light." This wasn't about achieving peace. It was about embodying presence. You saw clearly how dependent origination and Buddha nature were not separate. One showed you the web. The other reminded you that you were never outside it. You began bowing to ordinary things, your toothbrush, the kettle, your old shoes. Each became a doorway. A child once asked, "What is the most important practice?" You said, "The one you are doing, with all your heart," and they grinned and returned to coloring. You realized then, the Buddha is not only in awakening, but in crayons, in soup, in soil. You ended your days not with accomplishment, but with gratitude, for the sweat on your back, for the tea stain on your robe, for the stories shared under starlight. This was the final insight, not that you had arrived, but that there was nowhere else to go. As we close this journey through dependent origination, karma, mindfulness, and the everyday presence of the Buddha nature, one truth remains gently but unmistakably clear. Life is not a puzzle to be solved, but a poem to be lived. Each act, each breath, each pause holds within it the possibility of awakening, not in some distant future, but now. The teachings we explored were not merely philosophies, but invitations to see more deeply, to respond more wisely, and to live more kindly, whether in the falling of a leaf, the breaking of a bowl, or the forgiveness of oneself. Each moment carries the echo of countless causes and opens a door to transformation. In a world that moves fast, the Dharma teaches us to slow down, in a world that values outcomes. It asks us to value presence. In a world full of noise, it reminds us to listen to our breath, to the cries of others, to the silence that surrounds all things. If these reflections have stirred something in you, pause with it, breathe with it, and let it guide you. And if this journey has offered you even a moment of stillness or insight, we invite you to share it. Like this video, leave a comment about what resonated with you, and subscribe to this channel to continue walking this path together. In the next video, we'll explore how mindfulness can be deepened through everyday rituals, turning ordinary acts into sacred ones. Until then, may you walk gently, may you see clearly, and may you remember, you already hold the light you seek.